a single dad barely making ends meet, holding his young son's hand on a crowded morning bus. But when a tired woman stepped on and no one offered help, he stood up without hesitation. He had no idea she was a billionaire. She had no idea he was about to lose everything, and neither knew that one small act of kindness would change their lives in ways they never imagined.
The bus lurched to a stop, brakes hissing in the pre-dawn silence. Daniel Harris stood near the back, one arm wrapped around an overhead pole, the other holding his son's hand. 6-year-old Noah pressed against his father's leg as strangers shuffled past them in the dim light. The doors folded open with a mechanical groan. She stepped aboard slowly. An older woman, maybe 60, wearing a faded blue jacket that had seen too many winters. Her eyes swept the crowded bus, searching. Every seat was taken. People stared at their phones, their newspapers, their own reflections in the dark windows. No one moved. Daniel looked down at Noah, then back at the woman. He didn't think about it. He simply let go of the pole, tapped Noah's shoulder, and stood. The woman's eyes found his. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she sat down, her shoulders dropping with relief she tried to hide. The bus rolled forward into the morning darkness. No one noticed, no one cared. But the woman. Her name was Margaret Chen, though Daniel would not learn this for weeks, had not felt invisible kindness in a very long time. Margaret Chen had built something remarkable. From a single grocery store in Brooklyn 30 years ago, she had grown a regional chain that employed over 8,000 people. Her signature appeared on paychecks that fed families across 5 states. Financial magazines called her a visionary. Business schools taught case studies about her expansion strategy. But this morning, her driver had called in sick. Her assistant was dealing with a family emergency, and she had a supplier meeting at 6:30 that could not be rescheduled. So she did what she had not done in 2 decades. She walked 4 blocks to the bus stop and waited with people who would never know her name. It shocked her how completely she disappeared. In her world, doors opened before she reached them. Conversations paused when she entered rooms. Young executives straightened their spines when she passed. But here, on this bus, she was just another tired face in a crowd of tired faces. And not one person had stood up. Until him. She watched the man now, the way he positioned himself between his son and the press of bodies near the center doors. The boy was small, with dark hair sticking up in the back where sleep had flattened it. He wore a superhero backpack that looked too big for his narrow shoulders, and his sneakers were held together with careful stitches along one sole. The man bent down and whispered something. The boy nodded. Then the man zipped the child's jacket higher against the cold that would hit them when the doors opened again. His hands were scarred across the knuckles. Working hands. Hands that had learned to fix things, to build things, to hold on when letting go would have been easier. Margaret had spent 3 decades reading people. She could spot a liar in a boardroom from across a conference table. She knew when suppliers were desperate, when competitors were bluffing, when employees were about to quit. But she rarely encountered people who gave without calculating the return. This man had given her his seat as if it cost him nothing, as if kindness was simply what people did. The bus slowed for her stop. Margaret rose carefully, her knees protesting. Before stepping into the aisle, she glanced back one more time. The man was helping his son adjust his backpack straps. Neither looked for recognition. Neither seemed to expect it. Margaret stepped off the bus into the gray morning. She stopped at the top of the stairs and watched until she saw them emerge from a different exit, 2 silhouettes disappearing into a city that would never remember their names. Something about that moment followed her. Not the seat itself, but the way he had stood without hesitation, as if giving was the only choice that made sense. But what Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have known standing there in the cold morning air, was that the man on the bus was fighting a battle that would soon reach a breaking point. and her act of noticing him would set in motion a chain of events neither of them could predict.
Daniel Harris had once been someone different. 5 years ago, he had worked as a regional logistics coordinator for a shipping company. Not glamorous work, but stable. The kind of job where you clocked in at 7, managed routes and drivers, solved problems before they became crises, and went home knowing you had kept things moving. That was before the accident, before Sarah. His wife had been driving home from her book club meeting on a Thursday night in March. A teenager, texting behind the wheel, drifted across the center line on Riverside Drive. Sarah never had time to react. The police said it was instantaneous. They said she didn't suffer. Daniel nodded when they told him this, holding Noah, who was only 18 months old, and crying for a mother who would never come home. The months after were a blur. Bereavement leave turned into unpaid leave. Unpaid leave turned into difficult conversations with his supervisor about commitment and reliability. Daniel tried to explain that he couldn't travel anymore, couldn't work the weekend shifts that had once earned him bonuses. He had a toddler who woke up screaming for his mother. He had daycare pickups that couldn't wait. He had a life that no longer fit the shape his career demanded. The company was sympathetic at first, then they were understanding, then they were practical. When they restructured his department, Daniel's position was eliminated. They offered him a severance package and a handshake. Nothing personal, they said, just business. He found work driving a delivery truck. The pay was less, but the hours were predictable. He could drop Noah at daycare, work his route, and pick him up before dinner. It was enough to cover rent on their small apartment in Queens, enough for groceries and the occasional trip to the playground. Not enough for emergencies. Not enough for the future he had planned when Sarah was alive. Sarah's brother had started calling 6 months ago. Casual at first, just checking in, making sure Daniel was managing. Then the questions became sharper. Was Noah eating well? Was he hitting his developmental milestones? Wouldn't it be easier if Daniel had help, real help, from family who had resources? Last month, the brother had brought a lawyer. They sat in Daniel's cramped living room and explained, very reasonably, that they only wanted what was best for Noah. That raising a child alone was difficult, that they had a guest house, money for private schools, opportunities Daniel couldn't provide. Daniel had listened without interrupting. Then he had asked them to leave and never come back. They were still circling, though. He could feel it. Every scraped knee, every missed parent-teacher conference, every worn-out shoe became evidence in a case they were building. They were waiting for him to fail. And some days, Daniel worried they wouldn't have to wait long. The morning he gave his seat to the older woman, Daniel had been awake since 4:15. The heating in their apartment had stopped working again, and he had spent 2 hours in the basement trying to coax warmth from ancient pipes before Noah woke up. His coffee had gone cold, his eyes burned with exhaustion. But when he saw the woman standing there, swaying slightly as the bus moved, he didn't think about any of that. He just stood up. Noah asked him about it 3 blocks from the bus stop, his small hand warm inside Daniel's larger one. "Dad, why do you always do that? Give your seat away?" Daniel slowed his pace. He hadn't realized his son was paying attention to these small moments. "Because some people need it more than we do, buddy." "How do you know?" "You don't always know, that's the thing. You just help when you can and hope it matters." Noah was quiet for half a block, thinking. Then, "Mom used to do that too." Daniel felt the familiar ache behind his ribs. "Yeah, she did. I remember she gave her coat to someone once, outside the grocery store. She came home really cold." Daniel remembered. It had been raining, and Sarah had seen a young woman sitting on the curb, soaking wet and sobbing. She had walked over without hesitation, draped her coat around the stranger's shoulders, and come back shivering. When Daniel asked why, Sarah had just smiled. "She needed it more than I did." That was Sarah, always giving, always seeing people others walked past. "Your mom believed everyone deserves kindness," Daniel said carefully, "even strangers, especially strangers. Even when they can't give anything back? Especially then." They reached the school gates. Other parents were arriving now, expensive cars pulling up to drop off children in designer backpacks. Daniel knelt and zipped Noah's jacket all the way up. "Have a good day, Noah." "Love you, Dad." "Love you more than the whole sky."
He watched Noah run toward the building, his too big backpack bouncing. Then Daniel turned back toward the bus stop, back toward another day of delivery routes and aching shoulders. But something felt different this morning, lighter somehow. He had given a stranger his seat. His son had noticed. And in noticing, Noah had reminded him why he kept going. Not for recognition, not for reward, but because Sarah had believed he was capable of being someone good, and he would not let her down. What Daniel didn't know was that Margaret Chen had spent the entire morning thinking about him, and what neither of them knew was that 3 weeks later their paths would cross again in a way that would change everything. Margaret Chen could not stop thinking about the bus. 3 weeks had passed, and still the image returned to her. The man standing without hesitation, the small boy watching his father with absolute trust, the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to prove but gave anyway. She sat in her corner office now, 43 floors above the city, staring at quarterly reports she could not focus on. Her CFO had presented strong numbers. The board had approved her expansion into New Jersey. By every measure that mattered to Wall Street, she was winning. So why did she feel like she was losing something? Margaret had not always lived in corner offices. She had grown up in a rent-controlled apartment in Chinatown, the daughter of immigrants who worked 3 jobs between them. Her father had delivered food, her mother had cleaned hotel rooms, and every Sunday, without fail, her father had walked 2 blocks to check on their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, bringing her groceries she could not carry herself. "Why do you do that, Ba?" Margaret had asked once, maybe 8 years old. "She doesn't pay you." Her father had looked at her with surprise. "Pay? Margaret, we help people because it's right, not because it pays." She had believed that once. She had built her first store on that principle: fair prices, good jobs, respect for everyone who walked through the door. But somewhere between the first store and the 50th, something had shifted. Success demanded efficiency. Growth required sacrifice, and slowly, without noticing exactly when, Margaret had stopped asking whether her decisions were kind. She only asked whether they were profitable. The man on the bus had reminded her of her father, that same quiet certainty that giving was simply what you did. Margaret pressed the intercom. "Cancel my afternoon meetings." Her assistant's voice came back carefully. "All of them, Miss Chen? The supplier calls." "Reschedule everything. I need the afternoon." She released the button before her assistant could ask why. The truth was, Margaret did not have a good answer. She only knew she needed to think, really think, about who she had become and whether that person was worth being. She started taking the bus again, not every day, but once a week, always at different times. She told herself it was research, a way to understand her customers better, but really she was looking. She did not find him on the bus. She found him at a library. Margaret had gone to inspect a property her company owned in Brooklyn, an old warehouse they were converting into a distribution center. On her way out, she passed the public library next door and saw through the window a group of children sitting in a circle, and there he was. The man from the bus sat on a small chair, a picture book open in his hands, reading aloud. His son sat in the front row, watching his father with the focused attention of a child who had heard this story many times but still loved every word. Margaret stopped. She watched him read with different voices for each character.
deep and gruff for the bear, high and squeaky for the mouse. The children laughed. One little girl shouted out what would happen next, and the man paused to let her speak, nodding seriously as if her opinion mattered deeply. He looked different here than on the bus, less burdened, as if this room, these children, were the place where he could finally breathe. Margaret waited until the story ended, until the children scattered to other corners of the library. Then she approached. "That was wonderful," she said. The man turned. Up close she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the gray starting at his temples. He looked at her without recognition, which was both a relief and oddly disappointing. "Thank you," he said. "I volunteer here on Thursdays, when my schedule allows. Your son is lucky to have you." The man glanced at the boy, who was now helping a younger child reach a book on a high shelf. "I'm lucky to have him." Margaret hesitated. She was not accustomed to small talk. Years of boardrooms had trained it out of her. "I'm Margaret," she said. "Daniel." He extended his hand. His grip was firm, but not aggressive. "Daniel Harris. It's nice to meet you, Daniel." Noah appeared at his father's side, tugging his sleeve. "Dad, can we get hot chocolate? The place across the street has the good kind with marshmallows." Daniel looked at his son, then back at Margaret. "I should go. It was nice meeting you." She watched them leave, the boy's hand in his father's, disappearing into the ordinary afternoon.
Margaret stood there for a long time, surrounded by shelves of books and the quiet murmur of readers. Daniel Harris was exactly the kind of person she had spent 30 years forgetting existed. Kind without strategy, generous without expecting return. Walking back to her car, her mind already turning, she had resources. She could help. A job at one of her warehouses, a scholarship fund for his son, an anonymous donation to cover whatever struggles he faced. But even as she planned, something nagged at her, a small voice that sounded like her father, like the man she had just watched read stories to children. Daniel had not asked for help. He had not complained. He had not looked at her like someone who wanted to be saved. And Margaret was beginning to understand that helping people who had not asked was not kindness at all. It was just another way of staying in control. Still, she could not let this go. She made calls, quiet inquiries through channels that could not be traced back to her. Within a week, she knew about the accident, the job he had lost, the in-laws who were circling. She knew about Noah's school and the tuition increase coming next year that Daniel probably could not afford. So she acted, carefully, anonymously. A scholarship fund for single parents at Noah's school. The paperwork was clean, the trail untraceable. Daniel would never know where the money came from. He would simply receive a letter saying his son's tuition had been covered. It was perfect, elegant, the kind of help that could not be refused because it could not be identified. Margaret felt good about it for exactly 9 days. Then Daniel found out. And when he confronted her in that library, his eyes hard with something she had not expected, anger, betrayal, and a dignity she had accidentally tried to steal, Margaret realized she had not helped him at all. She had only made everything worse. Daniel stood in the library entrance, his arms crossed, waiting. When Margaret arrived for what she thought was a casual visit, she found him blocking her path. "I know what you did," he said quietly. Margaret's stomach dropped. She had been so careful. "I don't—" "The scholarship, Noah's tuition." His voice was calm, but his jaw was tight. "I'm a delivery driver, Miss Chen, not an idiot. I asked questions, made some calls. Took a while, but I figured it out." Margaret felt something she had not experienced in years. She had been caught, not in a lie exactly, but in an assumption. The assumption that her help was wanted, that her money could fix things without permission. "I wanted to help," she said, and heard how hollow it sounded. "Why? Because you saw some struggling single dad on a bus and decided to make yourself feel better? That's not—" "I don't need to be rescued, Miss Chen." Daniel's voice rose slightly, then fell again. "My son doesn't need a wealthy stranger swooping in because she feels guilty about something. We were doing fine." Fine, the word escaped before Margaret could stop it. You're working yourself to exhaustion. Your son's shoes are held together with thread. The school was going to raise tuition beyond what you could, and that's my challenge to face. Daniel stepped closer, and Margaret saw something in his eyes she recognized. The exhaustion of being underestimated, of being seen as less capable than you are. I am his father. I will figure it out. What I don't need is someone deciding what I need without asking. The words hit like physical blows. Accurate, unavoidable. Margaret Chen had built an empire on identifying problems and solving them. It was her greatest strength. But standing here in this library, facing a man who wanted nothing from her, she realized it might also be her greatest weakness. "You're right," she said quietly. "I didn't ask. I just assumed. You assumed I was broken, that I needed fixing." Daniel's voice softened slightly, but the hurt remained. "You know what the hardest part of losing Sarah was? It wasn't the grief. It was the way people treated me after. Like my life was some kind of tragedy they could feel good about fixing. Like I was a project instead of a person." Margaret thought about her father, about the way he had helped Mrs. Lopez, not because she was broken, but because she was his neighbor, because kindness did not require someone to be helpless to deserve it. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and meant it completely. "I didn't see it that way. But you're right. I treated you like a problem to solve, instead of a person making his own choices." Daniel studied her for a long moment. Children's voices echoed from the reading room behind them. "You know what I think?" he said finally. "I think you've spent so long in boardrooms that you've forgotten how to talk to people without trying to control them." The accusation landed perfectly. Margaret had survived 30 years of business by staying 3 steps ahead, by anticipating needs and filling them before anyone asked. It had made her rich, it had made her powerful, but it had also made her someone who could no longer simply sit on a bus without calculating how to improve everyone's life. "You're right," she said again. "I don't know another way. It's how I've survived." Daniel's expression shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something like recognition, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "Then maybe you should learn," he said, "because throwing money at people isn't helping. It's just making you feel powerful." He turned toward the reading room, then paused. "The scholarship stays. Nowhere earned it, even if you bought it. But I don't want to see you again. We're done here." The door closed behind him with a soft click. Margaret stood alone in the hallway, surrounded by community bulletin boards and worn carpet, and felt something she had not felt in decades. Real shame, the kind that comes from hurting someone while trying to help. She had wanted to give him something. Instead, she had taken something from him, his agency, his dignity, his right to face his own struggles on his own terms. It was the most expensive lesson she had ever learned, and it had not cost a single dollar. Margaret went back to her office and tried to return to normal. The meetings, the calls, the endless machinery of building wealth. But something had broken open inside her. She found herself questioning decisions she would have made automatically before. When her operations manager proposed closing an underperforming store, she asked about the 40 employees who would lose their jobs. When her CFO suggested cutting health benefits to improve margins, she asked what that would actually mean for the families depending on those benefits. Her executive team noticed. They whispered about whether she was losing her edge, going soft. Margaret did not care. She was not going soft. She was going somewhere else entirely. Back to a rent-controlled apartment in Chinatown. Back to a father who delivered food and helped neighbors for free. Back to a version of herself she had left behind in the pursuit of something she was no longer sure was worth having. 2 months passed. Margaret did not reach out to Daniel. She had promised to leave him alone, and she would keep that promise. But she thought about him constantly, about what he had said, about the way he had stood up for his dignity, even when accepting her help would have been easier. Finally, late one evening in her empty office, Margaret did something she had not done in years. She wrote a letter by hand. Not an email, not a memo, a real letter on real paper with a real pen. She told Daniel about her father, about the grocery deliveries and Mrs. Lopez, about how somewhere between the first store and the 50th she had lost the thread of why she started. She wrote about seeing him on the bus and remembering something she thought she had lost forever.
And then she made an offer. Not charity, not rescue, an opportunity. Her company was launching a community initiative, a program designed to identify and support working families in underserved neighborhoods. They needed someone to run it, someone who understood what those families actually needed, not what executives in glass towers assumed they needed. The salary was fair, the hours were flexible enough for a single parent, and the position reported to her head of operations, which meant Margaret would have no direct authority over it. He could tell her when she was wrong without risking his job. She ended the letter with one line: "This isn't about what you can do for me, it's about what we might do together, if you're willing." She mailed it the next morning and prepared herself for silence. 3 weeks later, Daniel Harris walked into her office, and the words he spoke would begin a transformation neither of them expected, one that would prove kindness wasn't about giving from a position of power, but about building something together from a place of respect.
Daniel stood in the doorway of Margaret's office, his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked the same, tired eyes, working hands, the quiet strength of someone who had survived things that would have broken others. But there was something different, too. A curiosity, an openness that had not been there before. "I read your letter," he said. 3 times, actually. Margaret gestured to the chair across from her desk. "And?" Daniel sat down slowly, as if testing whether the furniture was real. "And I think maybe you're not the person I thought you were." He paused. "Or maybe you are, and you're trying to become someone different. Does that matter?" "I don't know yet." He looked around the office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, art that probably cost more than his annual salary, a desk that could seat 8 people. "My son asked me something after we last talked. She wanted to know why I was so angry." "What did you tell her?" "Him," Daniel corrected gently. "Noah. I told him it was because someone tried to help without asking first." He met her eyes. "He said maybe you just didn't know how to ask, that maybe you forgot how." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Fear, maybe, or hope. She was not sure she knew the difference anymore. "Agreed." They shook hands across the desk. Not as savior and saved, not as powerful and powerless, but as 2 people who had recognized something true in each other and were willing to see where it led. The first year was harder than either expected. Daniel learned the language of corporate philanthropy, the grants and impact metrics, the stakeholder presentations and quarterly reviews. He hated most of it. The jargon felt like a barrier, a way for wealthy people to discuss poverty without ever touching it, without ever seeing the faces behind the statistics. But he also saw what resources could do when directed with actual understanding. He saw families get emergency housing assistance that kept them together. He saw children access after-school programs that changed their trajectories. He saw single mothers and fathers find job training that led to real employment, not just minimum wage survival. And slowly, carefully, he began to trust that this was real, that Margaret Chen's company was not just performing compassion for tax breaks, but actually trying to make a difference. He still did not fully trust Margaret herself. She was too controlled, too calculated. In meetings, she spoke with the precision of someone who never said anything she had not rehearsed. But he noticed things. The way she stayed late to read his reports, actually read them, not just skim for bullet points. The way she pushed back against her own board when they tried to cut the community programs budget. The way she asked about the families he worked with, not their demographics, but their names, their stories. She was changing, or maybe remembering who she used to be.
One evening, about 16 months after Daniel started, Margaret called him to her office. It was nearly 8. The building was mostly empty. Noah was at a friend's house, so Daniel had nowhere urgent to be. "I wanted to show you something," Margaret said. She handed him a folder. Inside was a proposal, a new initiative, larger than anything they had attempted, a network of community centers across the city offering childcare, job training, legal aid, and family support services. The budget was substantial, the timeline aggressive. "This is ambitious," Daniel said slowly, flipping through pages. "Maybe too ambitious. You'd need local partners, community buy-in. You can't just build these and expect people to come. I know. That's why I need you to lead it." Daniel looked up sharply. "What? You've spent 16 months learning how we work. Now I want you to teach us how you work. Build this program the way it should be built, from the ground up." "Margaret, this is a $15 million initiative. I'm a delivery driver with a high school diploma and 2 semesters of community college. And I'm a factory worker's daughter who built a billion-dollar company." Margaret leaned forward. "Credentials matter less than character. I've watched you, Daniel. The way you listen, the way you see people. You notice things that MBAs miss. I'm betting on that." Daniel stared at the proposal, at the budgets and timelines and projected outcomes, at the possibility of actually building something that mattered. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Really?" Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Because you stood up on a bus. And when you did, you reminded me that power isn't about what you can take, it's about what you choose to give." And in that moment, in that quiet office high above a city that never stopped moving, 2 people who had started as strangers on a bus made a decision that would ripple outward in ways neither could predict. A decision that would prove the smallest acts of kindness sometimes plant the largest seeds of change. 3 years passed like water finding its level. Slowly, then all at once. The community centers opened one by one across the city. They were not perfect, nothing built by human hands ever is, but they were real. They had after-school programs where kids did homework and learned to paint. They had job fairs where employers actually showed up. They had counseling services and legal clinics and small libraries where volunteers read stories every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Daniel ran it all. Not from a corner office, but from a folding table in whichever center needed him most that week. He knew every staff member by name. He knew which families were struggling and which were starting to find their footing. He knew which kids needed extra attention and which volunteers had the patience to give it. And Margaret kept her promise. She came to every ribbon cutting, every community meeting. She sat in metal folding chairs and listened to parents describe their fears about rent, about health care, about futures they could not quite see yet. She learned names she would never have known otherwise, not board members or investors, but people like Rosa, who cleaned offices at night so her daughter could go to college, people like James, who worked 3 part-time jobs because none offered benefits, people like Keisha, who was raising her sister's children after an overdose took their mother. It changed Margaret in ways she could not have predicted, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, like rain wearing down stone. She started asking her employees how they were feeling, not just what they were accomplishing. She started leaving the office at reasonable hours. She started saying no to acquisitions that would have been profitable, but would have cost people their jobs. Her board worried. Financial analysts wrote articles questioning whether Margaret Chen was losing her competitive edge. She did not care, because for the first time in 30 years, she was not just building something profitable, she was building something good. One autumn afternoon, Margaret came to the Brooklyn Community Center for a volunteer appreciation event. Daniel was there with Noah, who was 9 now, tall and confident, with his mother's eyes and his father's quiet strength. He had become a fixture at the center, helping with younger kids, organizing book drives, teaching them the things his father had taught him about kindness. Margaret watched them from across the room. The way Daniel laughed at something Noah said, the way Noah looked up at his father with absolute trust, the same look she had seen on a crowded bus 3 years ago. Daniel caught her watching and walked over, Noah trailing behind. "Thank you for coming," he said. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the room fill with volunteers and families, with laughter and the smell of donated pizza. "Do you remember what you wrote in your letter?" Margaret asked. "About carrying more than you show?" "I remember. Noah asked me about that once," Margaret said. "At the last center opening. He wanted to know what I was carrying. What did you tell him?" I told him I was carrying the weight of trying to be powerful, that it was heavier than I expected. She paused. He said maybe I should try carrying something else instead, like friendship. Daniel smiled. That sounds like him. He's remarkable, Daniel. You've done something extraordinary with him. I just loved him and tried not to mess it up too badly. Margaret was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that day on the bus, about how angry I would have been if someone hadn't given me a seat, how entitled I felt to it, even though I'd done nothing to earn it. You were tired, Daniel said simply. Everyone deserves rest when they're tired. But I didn't see it that way. I saw it as my right, as something owed to me because of who I was. She turned to face him. You taught me the difference between taking and receiving, between demanding and accepting. I don't think I ever thanked you for that. You didn't need to. You showed up. You did the work. That's better than thanks. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. For 3 years she had been trying to earn redemption, to prove she had changed. But Daniel was telling her something different, that showing up was enough, that doing the work was its own reward. Across the room, Noah was helping a younger child reach a book on a high shelf, just like he had done in that library 3 years ago, the same gesture his father had made countless times. It moves forward, doesn't it? Margaret said quietly. The kindness, like a current. If you're lucky, Daniel agreed, if you pay attention.
A month later, on a Tuesday morning in October, Daniel took the bus to work. Noah was in school, probably already deep into his math worksheet, the one subject he struggled with but refused to give up on. The bus was crowded but not packed. Daniel found a seat near the window and watched the city scroll past. He thought about Emily sometimes, less painfully now, more like a warm memory than an open wound. He thought about what she would think of his life now, the work he did, the man he had become, the son they had raised together in the time they had. The doors opened at Fifth Avenue. A young woman stepped aboard, maybe 23, wearing scrubs that suggested a night shift at a hospital. Her eyes were exhausted. Every seat was taken, except one near the back, but an elderly man was struggling with a walker near the door. The young woman looked at the empty seat, looked at the man, then she stepped aside and helped him toward the seat instead. "Please," she said, "you need it more than I do." The man looked surprised, then grateful. "Bless you, dear." Daniel watched the whole thing. It was a small moment, ordinary, the kind of thing that happened on buses everywhere, or didn't happen, depending on who was paying attention. But he felt something warm spread through his chest. This was what it looked like, not grand gestures or foundation grants, just one person choosing to stand so another could sit. The bus slowed for the next stop, and there, standing near the center doors, was Margaret. She wore her usual understated coat, no jewelry, no obvious markers of wealth, just another person on the morning commute. Their eyes met across the crowded space, not with surprise, not with expectation, just recognition. She had seen it too, the young woman helping the old man, the small current of kindness moving through an ordinary Tuesday morning. Neither of them waved, neither nodded. They simply saw each other, acknowledged what they had witnessed, and let the moment pass. The doors opened. Margaret stepped off onto the platform, disappearing into the flow of commuters heading to their ordinary jobs, their ordinary lives. Daniel stayed on until his stop, then walked the familiar route to the center. The October air was crisp, and the trees along the avenue were turning gold and red. He thought about Emily, about the coat she had given away. He thought about Noah, growing up strong and kind in a world that did not always reward either. He thought about Margaret, the billionaire who had learned to set down her power so she could pick up something better. And he thought about the young woman on the bus, standing by the door with her exhausted eyes, who had chosen to give something away that she could barely afford to spare. That was the point, he realized. It was never about what you could afford to give. It was about what you chose to give anyway. about recognizing that everyone carried something heavy, and sometimes the smallest gesture, a seat on a bus, a moment of attention, a willingness to see someone as they actually were, could lighten the load. Daniel walked into the community center, poured himself a cup of coffee that was surprisingly good for once, and sat down at his folding table. Through the window, he could see children arriving for the after-school program, parents dropping them off, some in expensive cars, some on foot, all of them carrying weights Daniel would never fully see. Outside, the city hummed with 8 million lives. And somewhere in that current, on a subway platform, in a boardroom, at a kitchen table where someone was deciding whether they could afford both groceries and medicine, someone was making a choice. To stand instead of sit, to give instead of take, to see instead of look away. It would not solve everything. It would not fix the broken systems, or heal the deep wounds, or make the world suddenly fair. But it would move from person to person, moment to moment, one small choice at a time. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that movement was enough to change everything. Daniel opened his laptop and began his day. There was work to do, families to support, centers to run, a son to pick up from school who would ask him about his day and actually listen to the answer. And somewhere across the city, in a corner office she rarely used anymore, Margaret Chen was doing the same. Not building an empire, just building bridges, one person at a time. It had started with a seat on a bus, with a stranger's simple kindness, with the recognition that we are all carrying more than we show, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is set it down long enough to help someone else carry theirs. The rest was just showing up, just doing the work, just choosing again and again to be the kind of person who stands when someone else needs to sit. And in a world that often forgot the value of such small gestures, that was everything.